Hi, I'm Duncan Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to my latest video blog. Today, I'll be talking about the author John Wyndham, who is a great hero of mine. You may not have heard of him, but I think you'll probably have heard one of his books. He was born in 1903. Had a brother called Vivian, and they both had quite difficult upbringing. Their mother and father had quite a volatile relationship, and the father did make life very difficult for their mother, and they spent their early years. Going to several different schools and really having quite an upheaval. Eventually, when the mother had more control over the boy's destiny, they'd end up in a public school called Bedales in Hampshire, which they both very much enjoyed. It was a very unusual public school because it didn't have a massive emphasis on academic work and hence did not have a very big reputation with academic qualifications, which leveled a lot of people leveled a lot of criticism at the school for that. But they emphasised on other things, other things that they considered more practical. They had a lot of different activities that they could do, and the school was co-ed. Which was very unusual. Boys and girls being at a public school happens today a bit, but virtually unheard of in the 19s of the 20th century and the early 20s. The boys and girls were taught to respect each other and to be friends, but there was very little sexual education at school, and very few occurrences of anything like kissing behind the bike sheds or anything like that. They were taught, basically both sexes were taught to respect each other, which I think is a very mature outlook on life. And what happened was that the school was very close knit, so much so that when a lot of the people left the school, they found themselves wanting to live near each other, sort of like the security. They found the outside world a little bit scary, and in fact, the headmaster from another school criticised the school for not equipping young people to have enough to face the world. And John, or is known as Jack to his friends, would find himself living in with using funds of the family, whilst his mum would live in hotels for pretty much the rest of her life. He would live in digs in a building called a place called the Penn Society in London, which was a building that was I think owned by his school, and several of his contemporaries also lived there. It's like they all wanted to live together in a community, which because a lot of Wyndham's work will be about communities. And he had a classmate at Bedales called by the name of George Sanders, who would go on to be a very successful actor and would have a Wyndham connection later on in his career. And because he did try Jack at his hand at farming and accountancy and a whole load of things, but his heart wasn't in it. His love was for writing, and he could support himself in the Spartan room that he had at the Penn Club. And in 1927, I think he got his first story published. It was a sort of whodunit. Um, I believe it was published. A copy of it does exist. It's not available now. Um, he really started to aim uh, at fantasy science fiction stories. Of course, they weren't called science fiction in those days. They were called by other things. Um, but his first story got published, and I think it was an Amazing Stories. It's called Worlds to Barter. These are American publications I think, with a very modest distribution arm in the UK, but they're really American, and they're called pulp magazines because of the thick, cheap paper that they used. And he wrote a story called The Wanderers of Time, which was a tribute to his hero H.G. Wells. A real love letter to the time machine, but it's a original enough story to stand up on its own merits. He wrote a Puffball Menace, which was a short story about monstrous evil plants that sting and do all sorts of threaten mankind. That wasn't going to be the first time he was going to write about plants. He had another story called The Man from Earth, and these short stories, they really were very, very good indeed. They showed, um, I think they're as good as his more modern works. They're available in various compilation collections. In 1935, he published a detective novel called Foul Place Suspected. I'm very pleased to say that it's back in print, although not in the UK. This is from I got from America, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But it's supposed to be really, really good. And very soon after that, he had two other novels, both science fiction, published. The first one, called The Secret People, which was set in 1966, although it was published in 1936. And it's got people flying around in cars, and it's a story about a guy called Mark and his girlfriend, and they're flying car, the Sunbird. Um, it's also about a race of an ancient race of humans that live below the Sahara Desert, which has been flooded for irrigation purposes. The only problem is the water's all leaking down below into the caverns below, and the people are fighting. They're sort of pygmy type people. They're fighting for survival, and it's a very, very good story. And then about a year later, he published Stowaway to Mars, which is about a British expedition to Mars. Um, Very, very good. There's a love affair in the book. I won't spoil it for you because, as I say, these blogs are not to tell you all the stories and give away plots and everything. They're just basically to whet your appetite. And as the Second World War beckoned, um, he wrote only one story during the Second World War, which he got published, and that was called Meteor. It was an absolute cracker. He would go into, whilst his brother Vivian went into fire brigade. He, I think, was doing sort of ARP work, and he hoped because of his age that he wasn't going to get called up, but he did. Um, excuse me, he worked in signals in the Second World War and helped out on D-Day and the Arnhem Campaign and several other skirmishes. Fortunately, not in the front line, but he was considered by and liked by the army, his superiors, and they wrote him a very good glowing report when he finally got demobbed in 1947. He'd hoped to get out very soon after the war ended, but He had a girlfriend, Grace, who he was very. They were both very much in love with each other, and she was a school teacher, and they were kept their relationship very, very secret from most of their friends for 30 years. Because being a school mistress, had it been found out that she was having a relationship with a man out of wedlock, she would have lost her job as a teacher. But they were able to keep it very, very quiet, and they used to write the most wonderful love letters to each other. Very much you see heroes and heroines in some of his later work were definitely him and Grace. And he would his early works he was called John Bainan, or John Bainan Harris. He had a lot of names, including Wyndham. So when it came to trying to get back into writing after the war, he would change his name to use the Wyndham section of his many names. And he wrote a story called Plan for Chaos about the Nazis. Now, in the late 40s, just after the war, people were sick of the Nazis, so it didn't get published. And but one other book he was working on, Day of the Triffids, did get published. It was published 6 months earlier than the UK in America, where he was known. And I think they said John Wyndham, also known as John Bainan Harris or John Bainan, to help him. The book was an absolute smash, and on both sides of the Atlantic, it got translated into many languages. And John Wyndham, after years of struggling, had finally made it. His second big novel, The Kraken Wakes, was also published into many languages, and the very likable couple are have a very loving relationship. And again, it's very based on him and Grace. You can tell. One of the stories that he published, one of the characters was based on his headmaster at Bedales, who he was very respected very much, and I think the deputy headmaster was also made us into a hero in another one of his stories. He would write the Midwich Cuckoos, which was turned into the film Village of the Damned in 1960 and starred George Sanders as Professor Zellaby, who finds he has a very unusual son, along with several other members of the village of Midwich. It's a it's a great story, and John Wyndham said that these children, they were very different, and they have powers, and they start to sort of take over the community. But John Wyndham said, when he was interviewed, that he did not consider the children to be evil. They were just a life form that were trying to survive. And he wrote a letter both to the guy who played David, who was the leader of the children, and the girl who played the leader of the female children, praising their performances. They are able their eyes light up in some prints of the film, but not in others, and that's because in the American prints they decided it would be more sinister to have their eyes light up. But in the European prints, their eyes didn't light up. The story in Midwich Cuckoos is a great book. It was remade as Village of the Damned, I think in the 1990s, and then a version came out quite recently, 2022, with I thought was a really great effort, but it got clobbered by the critics. But I thought it had a lovely little twist in it that's not in the book. But I'll let you guys get it out and read it. Or better read the book first. Other uh, stories that he wrote. Um, Let me just see. Wrote a lot of stories that ended up getting released in women's magazines. His female heroes were very, very strong for that kind of age, and he was, um, as I say, a lot of his. I think a lot of women like reading his stories because he did treat women very, very well in his books. This is my paperback of the Kraken Wakes. And then I've also uh, got quite a lot of these old Penguin editions, which I absolutely love the artwork. That's Day of the Triffids, and it says it on the back of the book, just on 500,000 copies sold in Penguin. This was 1974. A fantastic, frightening, but entirely plausible. John Wyndham's famous story of a world dominated by monstrous stinging plants captures the imagination like the best of H.G. Wells. Now, Wyndham would love this comparison to H.G. Wells, who was his hero, and uh, but he was very, very different from Wells. Wells was a showman who loved attention. John Wyndham was a very modest and quiet and shy man who kept away from the public eye as much as possible. He wasn't a loner. He had quite a large group of friends, but he kept them way away from his private life, away from Grace. That's why nobody knew about their relationship. And he again, his writing, he kept his writing sort of almost separate from them until he started up a science fiction club with some friends. Um, the He also wrote. This is one of a very, very good story about space travel. He tended to steer away from space travel. It's called The Outward Urge. And it says writing with Lucas Parks. Well, Lucas Parks was just another name of his, but it's about the Troon family, about 150 years of space exploration by the Troon family, and Ticker Troon, one of the heroes, has a ride on a missile in a sort of very gung ho sort of way. It's a great book. We've got here, we have a very nice cover for the Midwich Cuckoos. Just such a great film, the 1960 um, adaptation, Village of the Damned. George Sanders is just fabulous in it. This is The Seeds of Time, which is a compilation book with some very fine stories in it. Dumb Martian, which deals with abuse of women. It's written in the 50s, might be even earlier than that. Survival, it's very gruesome story about a ship that gets stuck in outer space and has to wait for rescue. And a meteor, the one that he read got published during the wartime, which is just fabulous, really, really good. And what happens in many of his books, disasters happen, and like H.G. Wells, his characters are mostly everyday people, Mr. Average, Mrs. Average, or Miss Average, or whatever. And they end up having to, a disaster happens to the human race, and they start trying to rebuild by bringing a community together. And so he had very much the idea of communities. Um, he reason why he didn't he and Grace didn't get married for 30 years was he wasn't happy with the institution of marriage. Under he felt the commitment side was fine, but he didn't like the way it was. He felt it was just too claustrophobic, and that it wasn't. There should be more freedom involved. Um, but in the end, in 1961, he did marry Grace, and they moved to Hampshire, to a little village that was very, very near where his old school was. And he continued to write, but his heyday, I think, was in the 50s. He found the 60s with a lot of the liberation that was happening in literature, in films, TV, plays. He found it a little bit hard to handle because he had his formula for writing, which was to scare people, but not scare them so much they wouldn't continue with the book. They would keep on, and several of his works were adapted for radio. We've got here The Trouble with Election, which I think it was published, one of the only two novels that he got published in the 1960s. This was in the early 60s. Very interesting book about trying to halt the age process. And then his last novel to be published during his lifetime, Chucky, about a little boy called Matthew who meets an alien, communicates with him. He's an average lad, and suddenly he's able to write in binary and all these strange formulas and things. And his family, when they try to investigate, along with the teachers, he tells them about this alien, this little woman called Chucky, who's in his head communicating with them. And the book is fairly sinister, but it was made into a charming children's adventure series in the 1980s, where Chucky helps Matthew to and his friends sort of foil crooks and things and get out of very difficult situations. And I think Ed Bishop appeared at he played Commander Straker in UFO. He was in it. Um, we've got the Chrysalids, which I've just, which was one of his very big novels about a race of, well, basically it's set on Earth after a nuclear holocaust, and there's a lot of radiation has caused a lot of animals and humans to change into to have different sets of digits on their hands and things, and the community where the main character David lives is his father is a very deeply religious man who believes that anything that doesn't isn't set to the standards of what is a normal human or normal animal must be destroyed, or at the very least, with the humans not made so that they can't produce offspring. It's That's really, I think, how he saw Christianity in some ways, as this rather um, draconian setup. That there are people called who live on the fringes who are exiles. Um, they think it is set around in Canada, what would be have been Canada, um, but it's a very, very fine story. And I didn't realise that some of John Wyndham's works, The Chrysalids and Dare the Triffids, were studied by at school. Oh, great! I think that's brilliant. Um, this is Jizzle, which is a load of stories that were published in women's magazines and things. It's a story. Jizzle is very good, and then it's got a whole load of short stories after it. Um, as I say, I'm very pleased to say that Stairway to Mars and The Secret People, which has been out of print for a very long time, have now been printed up by Penguin, which I'm delighted about. And we need some more of the more obscure works published by Penguin. Um, John Wyndham died in 1969, only about 6 months after Chucky had been released. We'd have two more books published. We'd have Webb, published 10 years after his death. Very disturbing story about an attempt to create a utopia on an island. Very disturbing story, but very good because of that. And then his Nazi story from the late 1940s, Plan for Chaos, gets published, and I think it was published in 2015, I think, and that's worth reading. A lot of people pick holes in it, but I think if you just read it and put the suspension of disbelief, let that kick in, I think you're in for a perfectly good ride. Um, so he only did one major interview. That was on BBC television in 1960. He would give interviews every now and again. He in his local village where he lived, I think it's called Steep. They had a special literature uh, festival, and people knew him, but they didn't know him. He was John Wyndham. So he went there to this literary festival, sat in the audience, and quite happily enjoyed it. But nobody, apart from his wife, knew that he was John Wyndham. And he had the science fiction club that he had, as a lot of his friends uh, moved away and moved off, and he wasn't enjoying it so much, and he didn't enjoy London the way he had done for 30 years. So that had influenced him and Grace to buy a house in the country, and they were very, very happy. Although sadly, um, it was only eight years or so that they had together in this new house. And he did go to a science fiction festival in 1957 in the UK. And I think he presented J.R. Tolkien with a award for Lord of the Rings. It was a space rocket, and of course, at that time, of course, it's fantasy Lord of the Rings, but I wouldn't. I'd call it sword and sorcery rather than science fiction. But I'm glad he won the award anyway. He would every now and again do lectures in places when asked to. But as I say, he kept his private life very separate from his writing, and that's separate from his close group of friends that he uh, would hang out with in the pub. And well, I do warmly suggest to you that you should read one of his books. My first introduction to him was seeing Day of the Triffids on the film on television in 1974, and then started reading the book very soon after that. And that year, I also saw Village of the Damned, which I enjoyed. And then I read Midwich Cuckoos very soon after that. He's a terrific author, and with a load of twists. And as some uh, critics said, he had a miraculous way of avoiding cliche. Well, I think that's a very apt summary of his work. So do have a go, and Dare the Triffids would be a really good one to start off with. But the Kraken Wakes, the Chrysalids, any one of them, I think, or maybe some of his short stories, just to whet your appetite. But do check him out if you haven't experienced him already. I find that not only his stories there are science fiction, but they're also about people as well. The human side of a lot of these things, of disasters, and uh, I think that's what makes his stories all the more believable. He was writing at a time when the first satellite was being launched, time when we had a lot of fear with the Cold War, and he doesn't exploit those fears, But with those fears that many people had, they can identify with a lot of the things that are going on in the stories. Before I go, I just want, because he was such a private man, it's not been very easy for people. He was offered many times to have biographies written about him, but he always refused. And this fantastic book, it's only been out a short while, by Amy Binns, Hidden Wyndham, really does help you get into to find out a little bit more about this quite private man. I've just finished reading it. I've deliberately steered away from talking about a lot of things that are mentioned in the book because I want the book to sell and do well. And I don't think Amy would be very happy with me if I did spill the beans and all the things. I don't like giving spoiler alerts out anyway for anything. But do check him out. He's if you're a science fiction fan and you haven't read any of his books, or do put that to rights. Don't worry, I haven't read Isaac Asimov yet, or a Frederick Pohl. I don't think. But I hope you've enjoyed this spiel. If you'd like to subscribe to my channel, and please press subscribe. If you'd like to take the like button, that would be lovely. If you want to forward it on to a friend, then that would be lovely as well. You take care, guys and gals, and hopefully I'll see you very soon. God bless.